A radio show host in Seattle called Paul Gallant.
You are definitely living in the hindsight world today, Paul.
Do you feel there's been a consistent theme with the interceptions?
I think every interception really has a different story.
I was just kind of curious what Paul gets to see.
You got f***ing grow, mother. Are you kidding me?
Paul Gallant, what the hell is wrong with you?
Hello and welcome aboard another episode of the Gallant Says podcast, available live on twitch.tv/Gallant Says and youtube.com/Paul Gallant, but also available wherever you get your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. I mean, today began as a good day. I was very excited that the football team that I have been covering for most of my professional life, the Houston Texans, hired DeMeco Ryans to be their 6th ever head coach. I was also amused that the other team that I used to cover, the Seattle Seahawks, who used to have Russell Wilson as their quarterback, now get to sit back and cackle at Russell Wilson needing Sean Payton to bail him out and potentially throw him out with the trash now that Payton's the head coach of the Denver Broncos. But maybe I should be focusing on another story brought up on twitch.tv/Gallant Says by Zach the Texan. Do we start with a moment of silence for 12 retiring? I'm not going to lie, I got emotional when I saw the video. I did. And in case you haven't seen it, let me pull it up really quickly for you on Twitter. Some are arguing that this isn't a natural video. I think it was Mike Florio who said he pre-recorded this. This isn't what the weather in Florida looked like at the time. Whatever. How dare you say anything about my personal Lord and Savior on a day like today, a dark day across the United States of America. Anyway, here is my Lord and Savior.
To the point right away. I'm retiring for good. I know the process was a pretty big deal last time, so when I woke up this morning, I figured I'd just press record and let you guys know first. So I won't be long-winded. I think you only get one super emotional retirement essay, and I used mine up last year. So really thank you guys so much, to every single one of you, for supporting me, my family, my friends, my teammates, my competitors. I could go on forever. There's too many. Thank you guys for allowing me to live my absolute dream. I wouldn't change a thing. Love you all.
I'm not gonna lie. I'm pretty emotional about this. For those who don't know, I would not be in sports talk radio if not for Brady. I wouldn't have fallen in love with football the way that I did. And I did love football. It's always been my favorite sport, but it became actually a religion for me growing up in Massachusetts as a Patriots fan, moving to Florida, not really having a whole lot going on in my life when I first moved down to Florida, except for a team that, for whatever reason, just started winning at a ridiculous pace when I moved down there. Tom Brady's been the most consistent thing in my life for the last 2.5 decades, and I suppose that is maybe a bad look for me, but seeing the emotion that's clearly in his voice as he makes this decision, as he walks away from something that he's spent over half of his life doing, it's hard for me. I'm not going to lie. I'm really thankful for all the memories, and I honestly need a little more time to think about all of the best moments from Tom Brady's career. We'll probably talk about it on tomorrow's Gallant Says podcast. It's 713, I always butcher that. I'm sorry about that. Can't believe Brady is calling it a career, he says on twitch.tv/Gallant says, but I think it was time. I'll even admit it was time. He didn't look good against the Cowboys, and he didn't look good a lot of this past season. Felt like the off-the-field elements of his life started to perhaps distract him in a way that a guy 5 years ago, 10 years ago would never have been distracted by anything. And again, who can blame him? I mean, not just the fact that he and his wife got a divorce, but also that he was a part of a cryptocurrency scandal too. There's a lot. There's a lot going on in his life. I have a question for today's podcast. We're going to try to do this going forward, much like I have on my radio show. And today, we spent most of the day talking about the Houston Texans hiring DeMeco Ryans. You might see right now wearing a Houston Texans starter jacket. You can buy it from Homage. I'm wearing a Houston Texans t-shirt. You can also buy it from Homage. This is the first day in a while that I don't feel like I'm wearing this stuff ironically as a bit to be an asshole. And I know some people on YouTube have been getting pissed off about me daring to wear Houston Texans colors because I'm not a true fan. I mean, I cover the team. I root for the teams that I think are good. The Astros have always, well, not always, but the Astros became an easy conversion for me, a guy who grew up in Massachusetts. The Texans have never been easy, but you should be happy after what the Houston Texans did yesterday. But anyway, back to what I was trying to say. We're going to try to do this going forward with the Gallant Says podcast. A question of today's show at Gallant Says Pod is how you can vote yourself. The Denver Broncos traded the 29th overall pick and a 2024 second-round pick in exchange for New Orleans Saints former head coach Sean Payton. They also get a Saints third-round pick in 2024 in exchange. That's a lot to trade for a head coach. But forget the price. Who would you rather have between Sean Payton and DeMeco Ryans, just based off of who they are, as a head coach? Is it Payton or is it DeMeco Ryans? And I hate to say this, but the choice should be, given that we do not have any track record with DeMeco Ryans to gauge whether or not he'll be a good head coach, even if we are hearing all sorts of wonderful things about him, the correct answer has to be Sean Payton. And yet here we are in a place that, you know, sports fandom lends itself to being biased. I tweeted this out. 27.5% answered Payton. 72.5% said Ryans. I think that's nuts. I can understand being passionate and excited about DeMeco Ryans, and I'm not trying to do that, dump on it right now. I'm not. I'm just saying, if you're having to pick between those two guys as your head coach and prices to the side, Sean Payton's the guy. Now, the tricky thing is, if you're Denver, should Sean Payton be the guy given all that you have given up over the last couple of seasons to bring in Russell Wilson and Sean Payton? A couple of years ago, if you told me that the Denver Broncos would trade 3 first-round picks and 3 second-round picks to acquire Russell Wilson and Sean Payton, I think most people across the league would have said, fuck yeah, that's a great combination. But now, a year removed from Russell Wilson leaving Pete Carroll's nest, it's a little bit of a different conversation. I think when you look at the Broncos trading that for Sean Payton, you probably think to yourself, well, they've already traded so much, so they're going to trade for Payton too? And it makes sense. I mean, if anyone's going to be able to save Russell Wilson, a guy who's not exactly the tallest quarterback, it's going to be a guy who's worked with a shorter quarterback before. But I think, as Mina Kimes pointed out on Twitter, it's going to be really interesting to see this partnership. And I do think there's a good chance that Sean Payton takes Russell Wilson out back and pops him. Not literally, metaphorically, if it doesn't work out this year. This is now the Broncos. They are Sean Payton's show. They are not the Russell Wilson show anymore. And I wonder if, as Mina Kimes said, if Payton, while working with Wilson, is compatible, because Wilson's a quarterback who likes to throw the football down the field. Drew Brees was a quarterback that threw a lot of short passes, threw a lot of passes to running backs, and is someone who I think was smart, learning Peyton's offense, taking what the defense gave him, and being a really efficient quarterback, especially during the first part of his time with the New Orleans Saints. As time wore on, though, of course, we saw the last couple of years, Drew Brees wasn't the same quarterback anymore. And the Saints disappointed in a couple of playoff spots because Brees' skills had deteriorated to the point where, he just didn't have a very good shoulder, didn't have a very strong arm. I'm surprised that many people picked Peyton over Ryans, and I understand there is a level of bias involved just because we are talking about my listening audience, the most of whom are, Houston Texans fans. And there are some Seattle Seahawks fans out there too. If I have to pick between the two of them long term, okay, that's where you could perhaps argue for DeMeco Ryans. But in the right now, it's got to be Peyton. Heard a lot of good things about Ryans today, though. Matt Mayoko of NBC Sports Bay Area joined me on my radio show and in great detail outlined some of the things that make Ryans a good coach. He listens. He knows when to push. He knows when to let up. He defers to his elders. Seems like he's got a lot of things in addition to having had a successful playing career that are going to lend itself to young players really liking him and doing their absolute best for him. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a leader of men and a head coach. I'm just surprised that this many people are picking DeMeco Ryans here. As far as Sean Payton and Russell Wilson, I know some people are watching because they know I used to cover the Seattle Seahawks, and I definitely have my fair share of thoughts on Russell Wilson, who I found to be tiresome at best towards the very end of his time in Seattle. Can Sean Payton save Russ? I don't know for sure. I'm pretty skeptical. I think there are a lot of people who believe that this was a one-year anomaly for Russell Wilson, but I choose to look at it like this. You're talking about a guy that over the course of his career was at his best when he extended plays and who also is really good at chucking it downfield. And while there were years where Sean Payton's offense did stretch the field vertically, towards the end, that just was not the case. Is Russ actually going to see eye to eye with Payton, or is he eventually going to try to frame him in the same way that it seemed like his camp was framing Pete Carroll as some old, out-of-touch fool who is obsessed with running the football? Because that's what Russ did with Pete Carroll. Obviously, a year removed, we now know that Pete Carroll probably had it right, and Russell Wilson was perhaps pushing it. J. Jin SC says, some would say Russ wasn't the problem in Denver. It was Hackett. Well, why would they say Russ wasn't the problem in Denver? Why is it Hackett? I mean, if you've listened to me long enough, all of the bad habits that Russell Wilson has had have really come to light since the end of the 2021 season to now. And I'm not talking about all the off-the-field annoying bullshit, off-season Russ. I'm talking about the actual player. When he can't extend plays and he's got to stay in the pocket, he does not see passes right in front of him, and then he starts to get into sort of a hero ball basketball kind of mentality where he just wants to shoot threes, essentially. He's pulling up like he's Antoine fucking Walker. And, okay, he's a great deep ball thrower, but deep balls are not a high percentage play, even if you do have Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf as your wide receivers, or Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton like he has in Denver right now. There's been a commonality with Russell Wilson over the course of his career. The play callers usually get blamed eventually. And maybe not the case with Darrell Bevell, who actually got a head coaching gig out of his time in Seattle. But Brian Schottenheimer, Shane Waldron most recently, it always felt like the coaches get more blame for Russell's struggles than Russell himself, when Russell's had a habit of getting sacked 40-plus times a year for what? His whole career, outside of his rookie year where they weren't throwing the football that much in 2012? So I'm wondering with Peyton, Frontrunner on youtube.com/Paul Gallant says it's one of the problems that short quarterbacks have is that they can't see over the line of scrimmage. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm a little bit nervous about the Houston Texans potentially taking a Bryce Young. And I'm not one of these know-it-all asshats online that believes that their study of film gives them the ability to predict whether or not a player is good. And I've said this a million times. I might be getting a little more lazy in sports talk radio as I get older, but I realize sometimes you just don't know what is and what isn't. You don't know what coordinator or coaching candidate, when he takes over a head coaching gig, is actually going to morph into a great head coach. You really don't know. Hell, you don't even really know it about some of the retreads who will never get opportunities again. And when it comes to the draft, too, it's the same thing. And my big concern with Bryce Young is that if he goes to the Texans, who do have a really good left tackle in Laramie Tunsil, who's under contract and I think needs an extension, and a good right tackle in Titus Howard, too, you need to make sure that you are protecting Bryce Young in the interior. Not just because he's got a small frame, and if a defensive lineman throws whoever the fuck's in the middle of the Texans' offensive line to the side, a struggling Kenyon Green and A.J. Cann, if he throws those guys to the side, okay, now all of a sudden, Bryce Young might be starting his NFL career learning that it's in his best interest to try to escape the pocket as quickly as possible. I think it does. I do think it's a natural skill to have to be cool, calm, and collected in the pocket, but if you're constantly having the offensive line in the interior blown up every single game, and on top of that, you're not the biggest guy in the world, well, are you going to really develop as well as you possibly could as a quarterback? So that's one of the concerns I have about what the Texans end up doing next. But I do want to say, I like the hire, and a lot of people got pissed off at me for suggesting that there are some reasons to doubt DeMeco Ryans. I went through some of them. First off, let me do it again. And again, I know some people are just going to hear this and they're going to act like I've been saying that DeMeco Ryans sucks the whole time. Honestly, all I can say to you is clean the fucking earwax out of your ears. But the issues that I think could be a problem are not Ryan's relationship with Nick Caserio. If Caserio doesn't work out, Caserio will be kicked to the curb. This one is going to play out. Ryans, I think, gets at least 3 years with the Houston Texans, unless he is an absolute disaster, which I don't foresee happening. I do feel pretty confident in that. I'm a little bit curious about DeMeco Ryans compared to Robert Saleh, who was the previous defensive coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers, who deserves credit for turning the 49ers defense into what it is. Ryans has done a great job maintaining it, but there was some talent on that defense between Fred Warner and Nick Bosa. Is DeMeco Ryans as much the reason for the 49ers' success recently defensively as those two great players, as Robert Saleh? You can't make a definitive argument. It's really based off of maybe observations of reporters and things like that were covering the 49ers on a daily basis. Personally, I'm not the kind of guy who's going to make an argument that it was more Saleh or DeMeco Ryans, because I don't fucking know. I think it's okay to admit sometimes that we don't know stuff. Other questions that I have about DeMeco Ryans as the new Houston Texans head coach: how is he going to delegate responsibilities? Is he going to pick the right guys to be his assistants? And how long will he trust those guys as his assistants? What if they suck out of the gate? What if they plateau? Is he going to have the stones to make really tough decisions, which involve firing assistant coaches, or that involves cutting players from a roster? He's an ex-player. He's going to be sympathetic to these guys. And maybe that will make him a little bit more honest in some of those meetings that we used to see on Hard Knocks with Bill O'Brien, where the guys bring in their playbook and O'Brien would be pretty direct as to why they were moving on from the guy. Is that something Ryans is capable of doing? It'll take time for him to learn how to do it, and he's not going to like it. It's going to suck. suck for anybody to be put in that role. All of a sudden, you're somebody who's making massive decisions. Those decisions hold a lot of weight, and you got to do it for the greater good, but you still don't want to do it. No one wants to fire people unless they're, like Gordon fucking Gekko in Wall Street movie, played by Michael Douglas back in the day. I don't think anyone enjoys firing people. Donald Trump on The Apprentice for a slightly more current reference. Good TV show, by the way. I enjoyed that. The season that they had to open things up featured probably my favorite reality TV show villain. And I didn't watch a lot of reality TV. I think I watched the first season of Survivor, and I got pissed off when they didn't vote off the guy who won. What was his name? Richard. At the end, like that lady, she could have voted off the old guy, or she could have voted off Richard. And she voted off the old guy. She should have voted off Richard. If it's one-on-one between you and an old guy, you're probably going to win. But The Apprentice featured a villain by the name of Omarosa, who was just so fucking annoying. And man, they really played her up as the heel on that show. The only other reality TV show I watched was The Jersey Shore, which I'm surprised by how much I loved that show. It was great. We had a Jersey Shore party once. I was dressed up like I was on the Jersey Shore. It was fantastic. The Broncos look pretty bad here. And I don't know how many people believe the report that Ian Rappaport put out there. Unbelievable. The Broncos spent today trying to hire DeMeco Ryans again today before he recommitted to the Texans. When he agreed to term with the Texans, they moved and finalized Sean Payton. Adam Schefter disagreed with that. Timing of today's two hires was completely coincidental. The Broncos were zeroed in on Sean Payton and didn't make any contact this week with DeMeco Ryans or his agent. It would make sense from the perspective of it has felt like since the weekend that the Texans would hire him. I also think, though, that we got to take all reporting about coaching rumors with a grain of salt going forward, just given how off it seemed like everybody, including the most connected people, were. Continued Schefter with his tweet. Denver was focused on Peyton, and Houston was focused on DeMeco Ryans. Jay Jin SC says, yeah, buddy, Jersey Shore was good trash TV. I don't want to sound too horny, but fuck it. I do wish that there were more attractive people from the Jersey Shore on the show. Wasn't a Snooki guy, wasn't a Dina guy. JWoww had her moments. Savvy was pretty cute, but I don't know. I kind of wish that there were more smoking hot girls from Jersey, because as someone who went to Syracuse University, yeah, there is some talent on that campus. Anyway, that's just me. You can bonk me all you want. Bonk, bonk, bonk. One of the funnier things sitting back and watching over the last couple of days has been a lot of folks backtracking on the idea that the Houston Texans job was such a bad one, or that this was a place that if you were to take over at, that was a racist spot. And to go back in time, I was covering this team doing the Gallant at Night radio program at Sports Radio 610 in Houston, Texas, the flagship station of the Houston Texans, back in 2017. I want to say it was Halloween. I think I was dressed up as Harry Potter doing a radio show that day where we found out that the NFL owners' meetings had featured a moment where Bob McNair had said something that could be interpreted as racially insensitive. I don't know if it was racist. It definitely felt more like an old man accidentally saying something that he didn't think could be interpreted in a way that it was interpreted. But he said the inmates were running the prison when talking about the way that things were going with the NFL and Colin Kaepernick and other players taking knees before game. The Texans were so pissed off when they found out that there had been a saying of the inmates running the prison, which I've never heard that saying before. I've only heard the inmates running the asylum. There was a thought that that game on Sunday against the Seattle Seahawks that they were going to play. It's so weird how all my worlds come together in a bunch of different moments. But there was a possibility that they weren't going to play that game in Seattle because of that report coming to light, which is just fucking crazy to think about. And the game does happen. It is played out. And in that game, it was great. Honestly, it was a back and forth game between Deshaun Watson and Russell Wilson. one of those games where you felt pretty good coming out of it, like about the Texans. You're like, hey, maybe they can compete with really good teams in the very near future. And then you find out Deshaun Watson tore his ACL like the day afterwards. I'm not going to lie. It was a bit of a gut punch, especially considering you found that news out within hours of finding out the Astros had won the World Series. That Sunday, by the way, was the same day as Game 5. That's the longest and best baseball game I've ever seen. Game 5 of the 2017 World Series between the Houston Astros and the Los Angeles Dodgers. Anyway, there was a perception because of those comments that Bob McNair is racist and therefore the entire organization is racist. And you go a little bit further into some of the things that were being leaked out about DeAndre Hopkins before he eventually was traded by the Texans to the Arizona Cardinals. You have the whole dynamic of firing two black head coaches back-to-back years after just 1 year at the helm. Like, there was an idea that this organization was racist and bad. And it is funny that coming out of it, even though part of it has to do with the fact that they've had 3 head coaches, technically 4, in the last 3 years, if you want to count like firing Bill O'Brien and hiring Romeo Crennel as interim head coach, they have technically hired 4 black men to be their head coaches over the last 3 years. That's definitely the most in NFL history. And the fact that there are that many between Romeo Crennel and then David Culley and then Lovie Smith and now DeMeco Ryans is something else. I don't think that it's something that you should hold up and say like, yeah, I have black friends, like some people have been doing of late. I don't know if you guys saw the statement that David Tepper had about how the Panthers are trying to break the going for old boys only dynamic that has run rampant across the NFL. That was a surprising statement. You should have played like the Battle Hymn of the Republic underneath it when David Tepper, the owner of the Panthers, said that. But I think that with DeMeco Ryans officially choosing the Houston Texans, I think we can finally put that storyline to bed and we can stop listening to all these national folks who act like the Texans gig was such a bad one. I know going into it, like there were some reasons for trepidation, but there are with every single one of these organizations that's open. And I thought to myself, okay, yeah, the Panthers have a lot of money, and yeah, the Panthers have some draft picks. So the Panthers' job is comparable to that of the Houston Texans. But the Indianapolis Colts are run by Jim Irsay. It seems like they want to hire Jeff Saturday to be their next head coach. The Arizona Cardinals just fired their head coach and general manager a year after giving them an extension and a year after extending Kyler Murray. The Denver Broncos just traded all of their assets for Russell Wilson and now has traded even more of their assets to get head coach Sean Payton, which a year ago would have looked great. And now you're thinking to yourself, I'm not so sure. It's not a bad place to be. It's not the worst place to be, maybe is how we should frame it instead. If I have to pick between the two guys, if I got to pick between Sean Payton and DeMeco Ryans, though, to sort of wrap this up, I would have picked Sean Payton. I don't think that haul is really as bad as some are making it out to be. I think that if you combine what the Broncos gave up for Russell Wilson with what they're now giving up for Sean Payton, there is an element of desperation to what they're doing. I'm sure they probably thought to themselves, you know what, we do want to do something with this first overall pick. Even if we can't save Russell Wilson, we got to be able to bring something back in that's Bradley Chubb adjacent with that 29th overall pick that we have from Miami, who got it from San Francisco. But, you know, I feel like that wouldn't have been that big of a cost for the Texans. Say they had to trade the 12th overall pick to get Payton. You still have draft capital after that. Say you had to trade 2 second-round picks for Sean Payton. You have the draft capital to do that too. Sean Payton is one of those guys that he comes in, he does legitimize your franchise. And while I do understand that there are some who would probably make the argument that he's not that much different than Mike McCarthy, won a Super Bowl early on in his tenure, and wasn't able to win for a while afterwards. In the case of McCarthy, Mike McCarthy, when he was with the Green Bay Packers, did feel like he actually was holding Aaron Rodgers back. Where in the case of Sean Payton and Drew Brees, I think that anyone who's actually watched the Saints over the past half decade, you would argue that Drew Brees just wasn't the same quarterback anymore, and that's why things didn't work out so well for them. Let's take a look at this poll now. At Gallant Says Pod on Twitter. At Gallant Says. Forget the price as trading for Payton. Based on head coaching alone, who would you rather have as a head coach? More people are voting for DeMeco Ryans. 43 votes. 74.4% say Ryans. 25.6% say Sean Payton. I'm sorry, this is the wrong answer, even if you are excited about DeMeco Ryans. That's the wrong answer. You should want Payton if it's just between those two. Not having to pay that price certainly helps out the Houston Texans, though. And I'm happy about this hire. You should be happy about this hire, too. There are only so many days, unless you're, like me, someone who worships Tom Brady as his Lord and Savior. There are only so many days that you get to celebrate when it comes to football. You get to celebrate a championship, sure. You get to celebrate maybe a conference championship, a division title, a great playoff win. But some of those great playoff wins are different than others. Like, remember when the Texans beat the Buffalo Bills a couple of years ago and the Bills just choked it down the stretch? And honestly, the Texans really fucked up with like a kickoff into the end zone that they didn't pick up. The Bills picked it up. It should have been a touchdown. It's been a long last couple of years. You don't get many great moments. A moment that inspires hope. And I don't know if we're about to, create a Barack Obama 3-shaded poster that says hope underneath DeMeco Ryans. But Ryans gives this organization hope and a shot in the arm that it has been desperately needing for a couple of years. And I do like the hire, and I want everyone to know that I like the hire. I think it's a home run. I just don't know how the hire will work. You can hit a home run for a hire, and the guy might end up being a bad coach. But you have won the offseason as best you can. You're in a spot right now where it doesn't feel like you're locked into picking the quarterback who might not be your favorite with the first or second overall pick. And I'm very curious to see what they will do in the draft because that's the next big day. We'll hear from DeMeco Ryans at his press conference tomorrow. Earlier today, I did think it was going to be today. Kind of bummed out it's not today. But I'll have some questions to ask. And if you want me to ask a question, tweet me at Gallant Says. That's my primary profile. You can also follow at Gallant Says Pod on Twitter to get announcements about the show and polls as well. Big thanks to everybody who tuned in, whether it was watching the show live, twitch.com/GallantSays or youtube.com/PaulGallant. I got to update my GallantSays.com website. I haven't touched it in a while. Or if you joined via podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, I appreciate you very much. If you haven't already, subscribe, rate, and review. Tell a friend. So long. Farewell. Have yourselves a wonderful Wednesday. We'll be back with another Gallant Says show tomorrow at